It was a September morning in 1931 when Duluth awoke to a discovery so unsettling it seemed ripped from a nightmare. Along the wind whipped shoreline of Lake Superior, workers found a burlap sack tangled among rocks. No ordinary driftwood. Inside lay a woman's torso, decapitated, dismembered, and anonymous. Washed ashore without a name, without a face, without a clue. This was more than a murder. It was a disappearance that had already been methodically scrubbed of identity. On the morning of September 20th, 1931, two city workers made their way along the shoreline of Lake Superior in Duluth. Their job was simple: clear debris after a night of heavy waves. The lake was known to spit up all kinds of things: logs, broken crates, even the occasional dead animal. That morning, the wind whipped across the water, carrying the scent of cold iron and fish. As the men made their way over the rocks, one of them spotted something wedged between the stones: a burlap sack. It was swollen, heavy, and waterlogged. Its rough fabric snagged against the jagged shoreline. At first glance, the men figured it was just trash. Maybe an old sack of grain that had fallen off a ship. Maybe garbage tossed into the water upriver. Nothing unusual. But when they tried to lift it, the weight was wrong. It didn't shift like sand. It didn't crumble like grain. It sagged. It bent. The men exchanged a look, uneasy but curious. They tugged at the twine knot sealing the top of the sack, expecting to find rotting food or scrap metal. Instead, the burlap opened just enough to reveal pale flesh beneath. One of the workers staggered back, gagging. What he saw didn't make sense, not at first, but then it hit him. It was human. Inside the sack was the torso of a woman, decapitated, dismembered, pieces missing. The men stumbled back in shock. They weren't looking at driftwood or garbage, they were staring at what remained of a human being. And in that moment, Duluth's most chilling mystery was born. Word traveled fast in 1931, especially when the news was this grotesque. Within hours, officers and detectives were swarming the rocky shoreline where the burlap sack had been found. The setting only added to the horror. Lake Superior was never just a lake, it was a force. Vast, cold, and unpredictable. It had claimed thousands of lives over the years, swallowing ships whole and earning the name the Graveyard of the Great Lakes. For Duluth, the lake was lifeblood. It carried steel, timber, and grain across the Midwest, fueling the city's boom. But locals knew its darker side: how quickly calm water could turn violent, how often it kept its dead. At first, the scene was chaos. Even hardened men, used to bar fights gone bad, bootlegging, shootouts, and drownings in the harbor, struggled to stomach what they were seeing. The body had been mutilated beyond recognition. No head, no arms, no legs, just a torso stripped of everything that could name her. But the lake wasn't finished. 2 days later, another gruesome package appeared. Not far from where the torso had been found, waves carried in a pair of legs. They had been severed so cleanly, it was clear this wasn't rage or clumsy violence. Someone had taken their time. The sight of them, pale and waterlogged, left even the coroner whispering that the killer had known exactly what they were doing. A few days after that, an arm washed up, tangled in weeds. The fingers curled stiffly, skin pruned from days in the water. Police couldn't shake the thought: somewhere out there, more pieces were drifting just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. After the initial discoveries, the investigation turned to the lake itself. Detectives believed the rest of her body had to be out there, drifting beneath the surface, waiting to rise. For days, officers and volunteers dragged the water with nets and hooked poles, pulling up weeds, logs, and the occasional sack of debris. Each time something bobbed to the surface, the crowd that gathered on the shoreline would go silent, holding their breath, waiting to see if another piece of her had returned. But the head, the one thing that could give her a name, never appeared. The lake held it back, or perhaps it was never there at all. Officers posted along the rocky shoreline, watched for days, bracing themselves every time the waves pushed something else close. Children were warned to stay away from the water. Fishermen whispered about pale shapes drifting below, shapes they swore weren't fish. The search dragged on, but Superior gave nothing more. And with every empty hall, it became clearer. The killer had known exactly what they were doing. Without a face, without fingerprints, without a name, they were blind. This was 1931. Forensics as we know it today didn't exist. No DNA testing, no computer databases, even fingerprints were useless without hands. All detectives could do was comb through missing persons reports, hoping someone fit the description of a woman who'd simply vanished. But what description could they use? They had no face, no height, no weight, not even a confident age. Doctors could only estimate she was a young to middle-aged woman. Beyond that, she was a ghost. The medical examiner worked quietly as the remains were brought in. Piece by piece, Lake Superior had given her back, and now it was his job to try and make sense of her. He laid the torso on the table first, then the legs, then the arms. Each piece pale, water swollen, yet unsettlingly precise in the way it had been cut. Officers leaned in close, some grimacing, others just staring, waiting for him to say something. Anything that could give this woman a name. But what he said only deepened the mystery. The cuts, he explained, weren't jagged or clumsy. These weren't the frenzied slashes of a killer in a fit of rage. They were deliberate, measured. Whoever had done this had taken their time. The edges of the wounds were sharp and clean, almost surgical. The room grew tense. If the killer knew how to cut a body apart this carefully, it suggested something far darker. A doctor, a butcher, or someone who had done this before. Reporters scribbled every word, desperate for detail, while detectives hovered, pressing the examiner for more. Was there anything else? A scar, a mark, a clue? But there was nothing. The heads and hands, the most vital pieces for identification, were missing. The examiner could only say no signs of disease, no scars of childbirth. Beyond that, nothing. It was as if the kidnapper had stripped her not only of her life, but her entire existence. That realization sent a chill through investigators. This wasn't a drunken fight gone too far. It wasn't random. This was careful, planned, and whoever did it wanted her identity erased. Almost immediately, the theories started. Some whispered the victim was a sex worker, someone vulnerable, whose disappearance might not draw much attention. Others thought she might have been an out-of-towner, dumped in the lake and carried by the current until Duluth became her grave. And then there was a darker theory: organized crime. Prohibition had turned Duluth into a hotbed of smuggling. Booze, money, and power moved quietly through the port. A torso and a sack could have been a warning. Don't cross the wrong people. But despite the rumors, no missing woman matched. No one stepped forward. It was as though she'd been erased from both body and memory. The newspapers wasted no time turning it into a front-page horror. Headlines screamed about the torso murder mystery. Headlines screamed about the torso murder mystery and printed every grisly detail investigators uncovered. Illustrations showed burlap sacks bobbing on black waves. Reporters speculated wildly. Was it the work of a madman, a jealous lover, a mob enforcer making a statement? For weeks, the story dominated conversation. Ordinary people avoided the shoreline, afraid of what might surface next. Parents warned their children to stay away from the water. Even longshoremen, the men who made their living on the lake, talked about an unease they couldn't shake, as though Lake Superior itself had turned against them. Despite the public hysteria, the truth remained painfully simple. No one knew who she was. No one knew who had done this. And as the days turned into weeks, the once loud panic began to settle into something worse. Silence. A silence that felt less like closure and more like the killer had gotten away with it. As weeks turned into months, the case that had once gripped Duluth began to slip into the shadows. Police had exhausted every detail, every angle. They'd combed through missing persons across Minnesota and even reached out to nearby states, hoping someone, anyone, might report a woman gone missing who'd match the remains. But the problem was simple and chilling. Time passed, the police file grew dustier, leads grew colder, witnesses forgot details or moved away or died. Eventually, even the newspapers stopped printing updates. The torso, the arms, the legs, they were gathered, examined, then finally laid to rest. She was buried quietly in a pauper's grove. The torso, the legs, the arm, they were gathered, examined, and then finally laid to rest. She was buried quietly in a pauper's grave with no marker to tell the world who she was. The case was closed, not solved, but closed in the way unsolved murders often are, swallowed by silence and bureaucracy. And that silence might be the most unsettling part of all, because it means whoever did this, whoever dismembered a woman, packed her into sacks, and tossed her into Lake Superior, walked away. They disappeared back into the world, never caught, never questioned, and nearly a century later, they remain nameless, just like their victim. For most people in Duluth, the torso mystery was a one-off horror story, a gruesome, unsolved killing that faded into whispers once the investigation went cold. But looking back, the timing is hard to ignore, because just a few years later, across the Great Lakes in Cleveland, Ohio, a new nightmare began. In 1934, 3 years after Duluth's torso was found, Cleveland police discovered the remains of a decapitated man. The following year, another, and another, and another. Over the next few years, more than a dozen bodies turned up in and around the city, all butchered in a disturbingly similar way, dismembered, stripped of identity. The press gave it a name: the Cleveland Torso Murders. The killer they called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. To line them up side by side, the similarities between Duluth and Cleveland are chilling. Both victims and body parts were discovered near water. Both had been dismembered with a level of skill, cuts clean and deliberate. Both stripped the victims of their identities, often through decapitation. And in both cases, the killer was never caught. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. The Cleveland murders stretched from 1934 to 1938, but Duluth's torso washed up in 1931, which raises the question, was Duluth the beginning? Some criminologists have speculated that the Duluth torso might have been an early crime committed by the same person who later became infamous in Cleveland. A trial run, so to speak. A practice in anonymity perfected years later. Others argue it was a coincidence. After all, torso murders weren't entirely uncommon in that area. Between prohibition, organized crime, and the lack of forensic science, dismemberment was a cruel but effective way to hide someone's identity. But the idea that Duluth's victim might have been the first known victim of one of America's most notorious uncaught serial killers, that's a theory too dark to ignore.